Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from today. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to be with me in this 1 hour to talk about how to manage user stories for more effective development and testing. My name is Magdi Hanna. I am the chief architect of Rommana Software, and I'm happy to spend this hour with you this morning. Before I start, I'd like to ask a question. How many of you have actually used or have seen user stories in Agile projects? All right, go ahead, raise your hand if you did. I'll take the count very quick. Good. Almost everyone worked with user stories before. Good. Remember, the purpose of my presentation is not really to try to sell to you the Rommana ALM software tool, but rather to give you some good ideas of how to manage user stories effectively. That's very important because many Agile projects started to use user stories and they found it very brief and slick and nice and good, and we all forgot completely everything we have known for years about requirement management. And user stories are not any different from a requirement. They actually a more simplified form of requirements, so we need to manage them the same way we always managed requirements. So what I'm going to do today in this 1 hour, I'm going to give you my over 30 years of experience working with requirement management, which I succeeded very well in taking those practices and applied them to user stories. So that's what I'm going to tell you today. Of course, at the end of the webinar, I am going to show you how Rommana ALM as an application lifecycle management tool does all the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about. All right, let's get started here. These are few facts we all know about user stories. If you have seen user stories, they are very brief. They're high level, absolutely. They're not giving us much more details about what the system must do or not do. And they really don't provide context. Why? Because it's brief. It's it's tell you that, as someone who is using the system in a certain way, here is what I'd like to do. Of course, let me just continue the last bullet here. It's also difficult to estimate time for user stories. I know some people are using the concept of story points, but story points are different from how much time is going to take me. Remember, the old-fashioned project management cares so much about how much time it is going to take us to finish this piece of work. Okay, we had some experience based with requirements to estimate how much time we need to implement a requirement. And we used something like function point, not user story points, of course, but function point is a much more robust approach to estimate the time to that we need to implement a given requirement. Now, I understand most Agile projects use user story points, but that's simply to compare to story points or to work with the velocity of the team to see how many user stories they can finish in one sprint. But really, does it tell me how much time do I need to implement that user story? I'm having a hard time with that. I try to use story points, and it's very difficult to do that. And people tell you this all the time, that story points are not about time estimate. It's about the how much work the team can do in a given period of time. So here is an example of a user story, just in case if you have not seen it before. As a customer, I want to be able to cancel my order online. I know some people likes to add at the end a phrase or a clause that says so that whatever, and they consider this so that clause kind of providing, because I asked it so many people, I said, what is the purpose of that last clause? So that they say because it provides context. Well, not true, at least not true 100%. And in my own experience using user stories, I found that it's a very ridiculous to try to force myself to add a so that in at the end of a user story like that, because what am I going to say? Those of you in the audience, if you have an idea of how to add a so that clause or something at some clause at the end to tell me a more context about this user story, please tell me that. The most I can think of is as a customer, I want to be able to cancel my order online so that I don't have to receive the order anymore, or because I don't need the order anymore, so that I save some money. I don't know how any of those things would provide context for this user story. Again, one more time, I might be wrong. I might be thinking wrong about user stories. So go ahead, those of you, I'm very curious to learn from me. If you were given this user story, what kind of so that clause you would add? Or otherwise, give me your opinion on the questions tab about would you actually try to add a so that clause or not? And if you do, what kind of context is going to give you? All right, go ahead, share your thoughts with me on the questions tab. Just to click on the questions tab and provide your answer. By the way, I need to apologize that I'm recovering from a bad cold. So if my voice does not come as clear as you'd like it to be, or if I take a second to clear my voice. But I think I will survive until the end of the presentation. All right, I'm looking forward to hearing something from you on the context clause, the so that clause. Any thoughts? You either give me an example of what you would add there, or give me your thoughts about would you add someone or not. All right, or some user clause or not. In the meantime, I'm going to go on with my presentation. Here are a few things about user stories. I don't know if you know them or not, but that is based on my experience using user stories. When I saw user stories for the first time many years ago, I kind of was nervous about using them. Why? Because my experience suggests that not everything the system must do involves a user. Remember, the way we write user story, there is always a role there. There is a role of someone who is using the system. All right. And not everything the system does involves a user or would be of interest of a user. Okay. If I have a user story about placing an order, okay, and I say, for example, as a customer, I'd like to be able to place an order online. Now, in the process of placing an order, you can imagine the system will calculate some taxes. How am I going to describe that in the process, in the user story? Am I going to say, as a customer, I'd like to see the system calculating taxes correctly? Well, maybe I don't want the system to calculate taxes at all. This is just one thing. As you can imagine, there are so many things systems do in the background as batch processes that do not involve any user. So I'd like to hear from those of you who are with me today also, how would you describe these things? So how do I describe those things? Guess what? I keep them as requirements. If I have something that the user shall do or must do that does not involve the user, I do not force myself to write a user story for it. I simply write a requirement. That's why a good practice in in a tool that allows you to maintain user stories is to allow you to mix user stories with requirements. I have no problem with that. I have no problem seeing a requirement in the middle of user stories. Not only for this reason, but for other reasons that I am going to state in the rest of this slide. Okay. User stories are also not suitable for stating what I call shall not do behavior. We all get very busy trying to describe what the systems shall do. Even when we wrote requirements, keep in mind, we wrote requirements in the form of system of things like that. System shall do this, or customer shall be able to do this. We never really spend some time thinking about all these kind of things that the system shall not do, should not do, or things the user should not be allowed to do. In my courses on requirement management and user story management, I try to educate people about this, because actually it is not what the system shall do that's important. It is what the system shall not do that's more important. Why is that? Because what the system shall not do, if the system does it, that breaks a lot of rules. So to give proper names for things, I'm going to refer to the things the system shall do, or the system must do, or the things that a user shall be able to do with the system. All those, I'm going to refer to them as positive requirement. And obviously, when we do positive testing, those are the requirements we're supposed to verify to make sure the system actually does these things. And I am going to refer to all the shall not do behavior by what I call negative requirement. So I always ask people, whether you're working with requirements or user stories, are you thinking about negative behavior? Are you thinking about negative requirements? And when we use user stories, we are only forced to think positive behavior, not negative behavior. Please, again, one more time, correct me if you are doing things differently. Correct me if you're willing to say, no, of course not. We use user stories, but however, we still think about a lot of negative behavior, and here is how we do it. Please tell me that. I want to hear this. I want to hear someone contradicting what I am saying, contradicting my experience. All right? And if you can't, then please take my experience as a given, and that's what it is. The last thing I'm going to say, that we all know that user stories, I don't know if we all know or not, user stories are not suitable for stating a quality requirements. What I mean by quality requirements, which I'm sure you understand it, things like performance requirements, security requirements, safety requirements. Why? Because none of those really involves the user. There's a difference between what we want to do, or what we want the system to do, and how well do we want the system to do it. Okay? We can have a system that does everything it's supposed to do. However, it does many other things it's not supposed to do, and also it does not do anything very well. So things take time, things are not secure enough, the system is not reliable, all kind of, I have about 16 things of those that I teach in my user story course about quality requirements, or quality objectives, if you will. Okay, so these are a few things. I want to emphasize that by listing those things, I am not telling you not to use user stories. I'm simply telling you that when you use user stories, be aware of these things. When you manage user stories, be aware that user stories are not going to do these things for you. So you have to find a different way of doing it. By the way, I am peeking into the questions tab, and I am not seeing any comment or input from anyone. Is it that you're not hearing me or something? No, I think you are all hearing me. I asked you for a few things, but I guess I will take the silence as you don't have really an answer for me. But at least I'd like to know if you would actually force yourself or force your team to write so that clause at the end of a user story or not. Okay. And also tell me if you agree that when we think user stories, we don't think about shall not do behavior. All right, I will go on. So typically, the test team will take user stories and start taking those, and of course they ask as many questions as they want, and then they start designing their tests. And with the same token, development teams take the user story and start doing the design and the code. And I am going to tell you clearly that this does not work very well, because in my experience, testing based on user stories or writing a code or design based on user stories does not test everything. It does not implement everything we're supposed to do. User stories are brief. We are not supposed to take them and try to use them as the basis for test design or development. I understand. You might also do what you call acceptance criteria, which is great. But I've seen those acceptance criteria from many people, from many teams when I went to companies to help them implement agile projects or manage agile projects. And I was very disappointed at how superficial acceptance criteria are. Given my experience using scenarios and teaching people how to do scenarios, I've seen most acceptance criteria that I see do not even implement half of the functionality that a user story should have, or does not help with the test team test half of the things that's supposed to be tested. That's why I've always suggested that people use the concept of scenarios. In 2 weeks from now, I'm giving a presentation on acceptance criteria versus scenarios. I hope to see all of you there, because that will be an important discussion to help us understand. Should we use acceptance criteria? Should we use scenarios? Should we use both at the same time? So check that webinar on the Rommana software website, and I hope to see you there. So I'll tell you why we should not be using user stories as the basis for our development effort and our testing. Simply, user stories are not as simple as we think they are. Okay, user stories do not stand alone. And I'm going to now tell you, if you must use user stories, which I'm sure all agile projects do, which they don't have to, by the way. I mean, you can run an agile project and do not use a user story. Again, one more time, I don't think that I am trying to tell you don't use user stories, but user stories are not a mandate. They're not required for agile projects. Why? Because the agile framework has many other things that are very good that help us develop quality software. And user stories are not part of that. Someone just invented user stories as part of the agile framework. I don't think it's even part of the agile framework, because if you look at the agile manifesto as it appears in the very first time, it didn't have anything to do with user stories. Again, one more time, I'm simply saying that user stories are something that has been added to the agile framework at a later time. People found it to be convenient and simple. But again, The good news is that I'm going to give you some 12 different, what I call user stories best practices. Here they are. And we'll talk about them one at a time. And as I said at the end of the webinar, I am going to show you how Rommana ALM as an application lifecycle management tool supports all these 12 best practices. First thing we need to do is to know is that user stories exist in hierarchy of details. The list of user stories in any agile project is not a flat list. So there will be a large user story that will be decomposed to smaller and smaller and smaller user stories. And that's why there is the concept of the epic in the agile project or in the user story management. An epic is a large user story that can be decomposed further into smaller user stories. But again, a tool that's supposed to help you manage user stories also is supposed to help you maintain user stories in that hierarchy of details. So I want you to go back and to check the tool you're using, whether it is Jira or any other tool. Can you organize your user stories in a hierarchy of details, not just a flat list? And that's a simple thing, and I expect every tool that helps you maintain user stories does that. If it doesn't, then throw it away completely, because you need to keep the context of a user story. You need to understand that this user story is part of a large user story, which is a large of another bigger user story. All right. A user story is written with certain things in mind, in the mind of the person who wrote it, whether it is a business analyst or a developer or a product owner. But the details of the user story will evolve over time. That's why we need to keep track of this evolution of details. That's why certain things we did in requirement management must remain valid, and we must always do in user story management. And those are maintaining different versions of the same user stories, not a different user story. Keep that in mind. I do not want to have, when there is a change in a user story, I don't want to have a different user story. I want to have a user story that's a different version of an existing user story. I want to keep that always in mind. I also want to keep track of the history of the changes to a given user story if I'm not creating a new version. So a new version of a user story represents a major change to the user story. But if I am making simple changes that I need to make those, I need to maintain or keep track of those, of the history of those changes. Now, the concept of a change request has always existed in project management and requirement management for years. I don't understand why we forgot this when we did agile projects. If someone wants to make a major change to a user story to the point that it is going to change the scope of the user story, or it is going to change the time or affect the time this user story will be delivered, then a change request need to be written. All right. And that change request will be used to do one of two things: either to create a new version of that user story, of an existing user story, or to simply create another user story. So the concept of change request is completely independent of requirements or user stories. It's simply saying someone wants a change. Someone is requesting a change. Now, we take that change, we analyze it, we study it, we do the feasibility study of it. We say, okay, is that change possible? Can we make that change in the current release or in the current sprint? And if so, would that change require making a change to an existing user story, or do we need to write a totally different user story? Or do we need to postpone that change request to the next sprint or the next release. So I don't see the concept of a change request in Agile projects. Not sure why. By the way, I run Agile projects every day, and these are the things I do. If you look at my Agile projects, I do have a change requests. And I write a change requests myself because I am the product owner of many of those projects. So I write a change requests. And later on, we decide if we are going to actually make that a change request a new user story in the current sprint, or a new user story in a future sprint. Or we are going to create a new version of an existing user story, and that new version will be implemented in the current sprint or will be implemented in a future sprint. That is user story management through change requests. Okay? So again, I always want to hear from those of you attending with me today. Are you actually doing these things? Or if not, how are you dealing with them? Or are we simply dealing with user stories as a very simplistic entity that does not have any of this? All right. I think number 3, you would have to agree with it. User stories must be collaboratively reviewed and possibly approved. Meaning what? In many projects, especially the projects that support some regulated industry, we must have a mechanism by which we approve or not approve a user story. I'm not talking about typical information system. I'm talking about systems for medical devices, for anything else, for pharmaceutical companies, where we have, we did the same with requirements. I don't know why we don't do that for user stories. So at some point of time, a user story must be approved before we go on with it. And it must be approved by certain people who actually have the authority to approve it or not. And once approved, it can't change. This is good change management practices. Okay. And I have to tell you that I have not seen this approval process in most Agile projects that I've seen. I want you to tell me if your project actually has this or not. Many of you who are running a simple Agile project are going to tell me that, well, approval or not approval, that's going to be an overkill to our project. I don't think we need to deal with that. Sure, maybe for your project, but for many other projects, it is required. Okay. More practices. Number 4, there is always a relationship between user stories. User stories do not exist by themselves. And the types of relationships between user stories are different. Some user stories need to be implemented at the same time another user story is implemented. One user story could be tested with another user story. One user story is dependent on another user story. Whatever. I think we have to allow a way to describe those kind of relationships. Absolutely. If you are not thinking about relationships between user stories, you're ignoring a big part of user story management. So the tool that allows you to maintain user stories must allow you to do this, to define some sort of relationship between different user stories. Okay. And the relationship I am referring to here, I'm not simply referring to the child-parent relationship. That's a given. The child-parent relationship I already talked about in practice number 1. I'm going to go back to that slide here. That's a child-parent relationship. That's simply saying one user story is a child or a sub-user story of another bigger, larger user story. These relationships are different. These relationships are more semantic to tell us what kind of relationship between those user stories. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with the concept of use cases or not. Use cases are very different from user stories. Use cases existed in the literature for so many years. I've actually been teaching and practicing use cases, I'd say, since the early 90s. I can't remember the year when the book by Ivor Jacobson was printed, was published. It must be before the early 90s. My apology. I should have remembered that year. But I can't remember the exact title of the book, but it was kind of the meaning of writing better software with use cases. And that was the first time use cases were introduced to the software engineering community. So use cases are there. And somehow it seems like when we started to use user stories, we forgot about use cases. Briefly, let me tell you that use cases are much more complete. So actually, user stories are at one extreme of the details, and use cases are on the totally other extreme. They are the most detailed. User stories have scenarios in them. We don't call them necessarily scenarios. We call them path. We have the main success path. We have the alternate paths. We have every scenario has preconditions, has post conditions, has the steps to execute that scenario, has many other, has triggers. Whenever I want to run a project, I want to really understand the scope of details of a given requirement. Then I ask the team to write use cases for that. So we were already suffering. I'm going to say that we're already suffering from the fact that requirements did not provide enough details, and that's why we wanted to use cases. User stories came to make the problem much worse by reducing the level of details. I have no problem with that if you use user stories knowing that they're very brief, they're very high level, they're very abstract. But then continue to use the other things that provides more details, such as use cases. So one more time, if you're using a tool that helps you maintain your user stories, that tool must allow you to create use cases and associate those use cases with the user stories, because those use cases will provide you with details you would never seen anywhere else, not even in requirements. Keep that in mind. Because user stories are brief, very often we have to rely on other documents and what I call design models. When I say design models here, things like decision tables, state transition diagrams, activity diagrams, things that provide more details about user stories. And we need to be able to create those documents and models and associate them with user stories. Consequently, then the tool you're using must always allow you to do that. A tool that gives me the ability to define a user story and cannot associate anything like documents and models with the user story is just not very useful for me. All right. When we going into project management, risks are there. There are things that we refer to them as project risks. And those are the things that could possibly happen that could hinder us from implementing or delivering the user story, either hindering us from developing it or hindering us from testing it, whatever those are. If there is any risk that's out there that could happen, that could hinder us from deliver a user story, we need to document this as part of the user story. I don't want to document it separately from the user story because I would like to always think about the risk and the mitigation of the risk in the context of that user story. When I look at the deliverability of the user story, I want to make sure to consider those risks. That's why a tool that allows me to maintain user story must always allow me to associate risks with user stories. Of course, you already know number 8, tasks. Every user stories have tasks associated with them. I have a question here. Let me look at it here. Actually, 2 comments. Diana says, we use the so that clause at the end of the user story to give closure. I don't know what that means, Diana. And that is how I was taught. Great. That's how we were all taught. But just to think about that closure you're talking about, how useful it is, how does it contribute to the ability to develop and test this user stories. I'm not going to criticize the practice because you're doing what everyone else is doing. I hear also Diana saying my requirements tended to be written in the positive path because I really on the developer I rely on developers and testers to use their knowledge and the experience to come up with the negative scenarios. This is exactly again what everyone does. We write requirements only in the positive path, and I keep in mind I teach test professionals every week, and I get very experienced testers in my courses, and I typically ask them the questions. And when I come to talk about negative behavior and negative scenarios and negative testing, I ask them, how much negative testing do you actually do compared to positive testing? If I have a course that has 20 people, I probably get one or two people saying, I do negative testing as much as I do positive testing. The rest of the people say not even 10% of my total volume of testing, because I ask them and say, tell me from out of your total volume of the testing you do, how much negative testing versus positive testing? And the numbers I get 5% to 10%, at most 20%. Then I go into my material for the course and show them the techniques using the negative scenarios, using them the how to create negative test cases out of the positive test cases, and they realize that then very soon realize that the number of negative test cases must be not only the same as the number of positive test cases, not twice, not 3 times, but at least 10 times the number of positive test cases. It is a fact that no developer and no software testers knows, but that's based on the use of scenarios. So I am going to suggest that next week, in 2 weeks from now, please, Diana, if you can attend my presentation on acceptance criteria versus scenario and see, and that webinar will give you a little introduction about how we write negative scenarios, because testers in general are not very good at negative scenarios. Developers, let me tell you that they will not write negative scenarios. They will not. They will always think about the positive path. Now, please understand, I will never generalize in any statement I make unless I say that. Some testers are very good. In my own experience dealing with testers over 45 years now, and especially dealing with developers. I have not seen a developer that I would really comfortably say this developer is very good in doing some negative testing or very good thinking about the negative scenario. I've seen some testers that I taught that really are very good in writing negative scenarios. But anyway, that's why relying on user stories and relying on requirements in the positive path, it does not help. I want to thank you so much for your input. And please accept my apology if I seemed to criticize your behavior, your practices, because you're doing what every good project management out there does. Okay, that's the normal practice. My goal today is to really give you things that we don't normally think about. All right. Allow me please to go ahead with my presentations. We all know that user stories have tasks. Of course, tasks are things like, reviewing the user story, developing the user story, testing the user story, writing scenarios, and we have to be able to associate those tasks with every user story. And tasks are really the same for every user story, unless there is some tasks that are unique to a specific user stories. And that's why sometimes I refer to those as actions. I will explain a little bit more of those when I show you the tool. I have only about 18 minutes left here. But again, any tool you use to keep track or implement your user stories should allow you also to keep track of the tasks that are relevant to those user stories. And not only that, but tell you how much time each task will take, but also tell you that which tasks have been completed versus not, so that you can tell if the user story has been implemented or not, or are we close enough to finishing the user story or not. It strikes me badly that almost every agile project I've seen declares that a user story either completed or not completed. Yes, but if a user story is going to take a long time, how close am I to completing the user story? Is it 30% complete? Is it 50% or 70% to complete? How much time do we have left in order to finish that user story? For some reason, we don't care. We don't care. We care about either did we finish it or not. So at some point, I may have 5 or 6 or 10 user stories in a given sprint, and only about 3 of them have been completed. How about the other 7? Well, we don't know. They have not been completed yet. Well, that's why we have tasks and we have percentage of completion for every task. That's what a tool shall do for you. Excuse me. Traceability. We've known about requirement traceability for years. Requirement traceability is a must for every project. Now, not sure why we forgot about requirement traceability when we started to use user stories. I'm going to come here in practice number 9 and say we should always be able to track user stories back to the code modules, the code that implemented that user story. I know some of you would say, why would you want to do that? For all kinds of reasons. For all kinds of reasons. If someone wants to make a change to the user story after it has been implemented, we need to know which code modules we need to go to in order to make the change. If we make a change to a code modules, we need to go back in the opposite direction and see what user stories have been impacted by the change we made to the code modules. And when we know, and that's what I call impact analysis. When I teach people regression testing in my classes, I tell them how to do it based on impact analysis. And impact analysis simply saying that if we change any part of the code, we must always have the ability to go back and find out which user story or which requirement, if you're using requirements, have been possibly impacted by the change we made to the code. And those user stories are the ones that must be tested under regression testing. Okay, so you do this user stories to code modules traceability for more successful, for more powerful regression testing. It's a given that you must always be able to trace your user stories to test cases and the issue reports. You want to be able to say, for this user story, how many test cases have been written, how many issue reports have been written. Because you want to always see how good the implementation of the user story was. There's a big difference between, I mean, we got to benefit from the data we have. If I have one user story that generated 15 issue reports, whether those issue reports are actually bug reports or other things, versus another issue reports that, another user story that created only 3 issue reports, there's something to be talked about here. There's something that we need to think about. What happened to that user story? And what happened to the other user story? Maybe the other story, the user story that created only 3 issue reports was not tested enough. So how many test cases were created there? And so on. So I cannot sit here in this 1-hour webinar and to try to explain to you the benefits of traceability, because the benefits of traceability has been established in project management for years ago, and that's why many standard organizations such as ISO and all the medical standards require that you must have requirement traceability. So if you start using user stories, requirement traceability does not go away. You have to continue to use it. All right. In number 11, I say, although you might be using acceptance criteria, but please, you need to also use scenarios. And if you're not convinced, please attend my webinar 2 weeks from now. And if you miss the webinar, then it is recorded at the Rommana website. So look for that webinar on the Rommana website, acceptance criteria versus scenarios, so that you know what the difference is and whether you should be using scenarios or not. There are so many benefits to using scenarios. Okay. And the last thing here is that we have to realize that user stories are of different types, not one type, not only functional. User stories are not only functional user stories, because user stories are not good for everything. Then we have to be able to have quality performance user stories. We have to have safety user stories, security user stories. We have to have all kind of quality, physical implementation user stories. And if you're not willing to do this, then please phrase those things as requirements. You either be willing to use different types of user stories, or be willing to mix user stories with requirements. Because in the very beginning, I said not everything the system does actually can be described in a user story. So that's why I'm proposing a new approach in which I write different types of user stories, or I continue to use my requirements to describe the things that I cannot describe as user stories. Those are my 12 practices that I've learned them from working with agile projects and non-agile projects. Please take those as my own practices. You have the right to reject any one of them. If you think you can implement any one of them, please go ahead. If you need help, please send me an email. I'm happy to help. Okay? Before I move on to the next slide, let me see the comment I have here. I'm getting a comment here that says, if we include both positive and negative scenarios in the requirement. These could become very long. Well, I'm going to stop right here. And of course, the continuing says, when do we know when to quit? I'm not suggesting that we're going to modify the requirement and add the scenarios positive and negative into the requirement. Absolutely not. Scenarios are different entities that simply associated with the requirement. The requirement is good as it is on a certain level of details. But I am suggesting that, and of course, please, if you want to know more about this, please listen to my webinar on scenario-based development and testing. You'll see that scenarios are not something to be part of the requirement. Scenarios are different entities that are associated with the requirements. They come between requirements or user stories and test cases. They are the very first step right after the user story or the requirement before we dive into writing a code or before we dive into writing test cases. You can call them high-level test cases if you wish, but please, no, absolutely not. Do not modify the requirement. Do not modify the requirement to include the scenarios, positive and negative. Scenarios are generated separately from the requirement. That's what all I can say now. And I'm going to continue the comment here. I'm glad you rely on your team to write negative scenarios, just to give them the tools they need to write those scenarios. I'm going to suggest that first listen to the 1-hour webinar on scenario-based development and testing. Okay, and if you need more details, please send me an email. I'm happy to help. Okay, thank you for your comments, and that really helped me explain a few things. All right, thank you so much. Let's continue here. So that's a picture that describes everything I said. User story in the middle, and everything else is around that user story. I'm going to leave that slide in front of you for a few seconds here, because I explained everything. So I'm just, if I put this picture in the front of you in the very beginning, you'd be overwhelmed and you would not understand why. But everything I spoke about is right here. Everything that's associated with user stories are here. So the bottom line here is that user stories do not exist by themselves. Okay? So scenarios, code modules, versions, documents, issues, risks, tasks, everything's here. All right. Now, I have about 7 minutes left to show you a demo of how Rommana ALM as an application lifecycle management tool does everything I talked about. Now, of course, any one of you say, oh, you want us to buy the software. Well, if you don't have a tool to do everything I said and you really want to do it, then yes, you might have to buy the software. However, you can actually try the software for free. But here is what Rommana software does. It has a repository that's SQL Server database. It does everything else here. And the only way Rommana ALM is able to do all the kind of things I talked about is because it supports all these test management, project management, issue management in all one box. These are not separate tools. These are all together in one tool. And it's also integrated with Jira and the Bugzilla and QTP, or now the unified functional testing from HP and so on. Allow me please to go very quick here and go to the, I was just opening it before, so I'm going to re-log in here. So this is a login screen. I'm going to log in. I'm going to look at the product owner or project manager. Here are all the projects I have. I'm going to open this project here. As I said, it's only now 5 minutes. Okay, this is the dashboard that tells me a lot of things about the project. I'm going to skip that. User stories at the very top here. Change requests are just next to it, as you can tell. So I can create a change requests independently of user stories. And I have the test sets, I have the documents and modules, I have reports, I have issues, I have also more stuff here. I have the ad hoc tests, which are exploratory tests. I have the use cases, and so on. So let me click on user stories. Okay, and that would give me a list of the user stories. The first thing you do, or the first two things you see, is that user stories exist in a hierarchy of details. That's the first practice I give you. Okay, and also you see that user stories are of different types: functional user stories, quality user stories, FDA regulations user stories, whatever the project allows you to do. Under quality, I have usability, I have hardware requirements, and so on. Okay, so now I can click on any one of the user stories. And this one user story here is like an epic, because it says as a user, I want to be able to configure attribute values for different project entities. Now, you can realize now that this project is actually a Rommana ALM project, meaning that this is one of the projects we use to implement some of the features in Rommana ALM. So that's this actually one of the features of Rommana ALM, that you can configure attribute values for different project entities. And now the sub user stories underneath, each one of them is for a different entity. Like here as a user, I want to be able to configure issue reports, issue report attribute values, requirement attribute values, test case, and so on. So I'm gonna just click on this one here, number 5. Okay. When you click on a user story, it gives you all the details you need. The user story has a description, because we need to describe something about the user story. And it has also acceptance criteria. And the acceptance criteria, you can add more anytime, but each acceptance criteria, you can indicate if it has been tested or not, and if it has been tested, if it's pass or fail or not. All right, so I cannot select anything here because I have not indicated that it's been tested. So because eventually all the acceptance criteria for a user story must be tested and must pass, right? And there are reports that come out of that. Because as I told you, I don't believe that acceptance criteria are sufficient, I have scenarios here. If you click here, this user stories has 24 scenarios. Okay, people normally would not write 24 acceptance criteria. Every one of those scenarios, I'm not going to go in details. You can listen to the other 2 webinars, the one about acceptance criteria versus scenarios, and you can listen to scenario-based development and testing. But as you can see, every scenario has a number of things here. Has frequency of occurrence, has consequences of failure or impact of failure, has probability of failure. Based on these 3, we calculate the testing priority, how important that scenario to be tested. These are very important. These are to do risk-based testing for scenarios. I don't know if you do the same for acceptance criteria. I don't think so, because the acceptance criteria practice does not tell us to do this. But that's one of the advantages of scenarios. So I'm going to leave that for now. Let me close this. Of course, you can click on any scenario, and you can see the details of the scenario here. And not only that, you can see down here that you can associate, you can write test cases for the scenario. You can also write ad hoc or exploratory test cases for the scenario. You can create a test set for the scenario. Okay, because every scenario, we're going to write a number of test cases. All those test cases will be in one test set. I'm going to close this and close this. Go back to my user story. Here are the issues. The issues that testers have written for this user story. Some of those issues are closed already. Okay, some of them are still open, and so on. Some of them have been assigned. You can look at the user story. You can one mouse click should show you what issues have been written, what test sets are there, what ad hoc tests or exploratory tests have we written for the scenario, for the user story. And here are the how many passed, how many failed, whatever it is. And you can click on it. By the way, any report, any screen in Rommana ALM, any link, any number, anything is a link. So if I were to click here, if you want to say why this failed, you can click on this. You can see the test. This is an ad hoc test or exploratory test. I'm going to close that quick. All right, so I'm going to close the scenarios, go back to my user stories. Here are the use cases associated with it. If I click on it, I can see the use case here. I have 4 tasks associated with that user story. And those tasks, as I said, are development, testing by developer, final testing, test design, whatever. And it tells you how, the completion, how far it is, and so on. I'm not going to get into that level of details, but you have all the details. If you click on a task here, it's going to give you all the details of the task. Who's assigned to that task? It actually says it here too. And how far are we? What's the percentage of completion of the task, and so on. If I want to see the changes of the user story, here, all the changes are here. Change log, kind of. It tells you what attribute has changed it, and it changed it to what, and who made the change. All right. I don't have currently a different version of this user story. As a result, I don't have a change request associated with it. Everything here in this screen about a user story. So that just simply tells you that a user story does not exist by itself. Here are this user story relates to 3 other user stories. Okay, there is even 2 custom attributes that were created for user stories in general. If I want to see the custom attributes, I click on this. If I want to see the source of the user story is here. All right. My apology for going 3 minutes beyond my time. If you need to learn more about Rommana ALM, please feel free to visit the Rommana ALM website, and you can try it for free for 60 days. If you need more than 60 days, then you can just request that, and we'll grant you the access. Here are the packages and the pricing, but you can try any one of the packages, including the full complete Rommana ALM for free for 60 days. All right, we are about to finish our biggest milestone, which is integrating Rommana with Jira, so that you can actually use Rommana ALM from within Jira. If you are a Jira user, you will be able to see Rommana ALM as one of the applications that are available in the marketplace, in the Atlassian marketplace very soon. And you should be able to perform all this stuff from within Jira. Coming soon, kind of. All right, thank you again for attending the webinar with me. Hopefully I will see you in future webinars.